Alright, so in this we're going to look at one more theorem. This is called the base angle theorem. The base angle theorem, it's pretty simple. What it tells us is that if we have two sides of a triangle that are congruent, so if this was an isosceles triangle, so again this applies to isosceles triangles, that if these two sides are congruent, additionally we know that these two angles are congruent. So given that the two sides are congruent, the base angle theorem tells us that the angles are congruent. And the converse of that is also true. If the angles are congruent, the sides have to be congruent. So let's look at a quick example of how we can use that in a proof. So let's say that we are given that RE is parallel to DC, so these lines are parallel, and we're also given that DC bisects RCA. And so RCA is here. Now using a couple different theorems and definitions here, we can prove a couple things. First of all, we know that these two angles are congruent because if this is an angle bisector, so because that's an angle bisector, those angles are congruent. Because these lines are parallel, this angle and this angle are also congruent because of the alternate interior angle theorem, and also because those lines are parallel, this angle and this angle are congruent because they are corresponding angles. So now what we have in this triangle here is we have proven that these two angles are congruent. And just like the base angle theorem says, since those angles are congruent, these sides must also be congruent, and that's exactly what we're trying to prove. So to kind of walk back through that again, we knew that these two angles were equal because of the angle bisector. It cuts an angle in half. We knew that these two angles were congruent because they are alternate interior. We knew that these two angles were congruent because they're corresponding, and then once we know the angles are congruent, we know the sides must also be congruent, in this case because of the converse of the base angle theorem, which is just doing the base angle theorem backwards. The base angle theorem tells us that if the sides are the same, the angles are the same. Do that in reverse. The converse of the base angle theorem tells us that if the angles are the same, the sides are the same.